I shouldn't have understood a single word he said, but I did, and that was my first mistake. The champagne tray felt heavier than it should have as I stepped through the ballroom. The crystal glasses trembling just enough to catch the light from the chandeliers above, scattering it across marble floors that probably cost more than my entire apartment building. And I told myself, like I always did, keep your head down, keep moving, don't listen, don't get noticed, just survive the shift and go home. But then I heard it, low and smooth, threaded through the hum of polite laughter and quiet deals, a language that didn't belong in a place like this unless you knew exactly what it meant. And my fingers tightened around the edge of the tray before I could stop myself. Because Sicilian wasn't something you forgot. Not when you grew up hearing it whispered behind closed doors. Not when it was the last thing someone said before everything in your life changed. And I froze for half a second too long before forcing my feet forward again, pretending I hadn't noticed, pretending I was just another invisible waitress in a black uniform that didn't quite fit right. But my ears betrayed me, catching every syllable as it rolled off his tongue, sharp, deliberate, amused, like he was playing with something he knew he controlled. And I didn't need to look to know who it was, because everyone in that room had already shifted around him like gravity had changed direction, conversations softening, bodies angling away just enough to give him space without making it obvious. Power didn't need to announce itself. It just existed. And when I finally let my eyes lift for a fraction of a second, there he was, Luca de Lorenzo, standing near the center of it all in a perfectly tailored black suit, one hand resting casually in his pocket, while the other held a glass of whiskey like it belonged there, like everything belonged to him. His expression calm, but his eyes, dark, watchful, calculating, moved over the room with a kind of quiet precision that made something in my chest tighten. And then he spoke again, this time slower, the Sicilian more deliberate, almost exaggerated, like he wanted someone to hear it, like he wanted to make a point, and the men around him chuckled under their breath, a low ripple of amusement that didn't quite reach their eyes, because whatever he had said wasn't just a joke, it was a test. And I knew that without knowing how I knew. I knew because I had heard that tone before, the kind that measured people without them realizing they were being weighed. And I told myself to keep walking, to keep my eyes down, to set the drinks on the table and move on. Like I hadn't just understood every word he said about the help being too slow, too soft, too easy to ignore. But something inside me refused to stay quiet, something old and stubborn and sharper than it should have been. And before I could stop it, before I could remind myself that this wasn't my world, and he wasn't someone you corrected, my voice slipped out, steady, controlled, and just loud enough to reach him, replying in the same language he had used, matching his tone word for word. Except mine carried something his didn't, certainty. And the moment the words left my mouth, the air changed. The quiet conversations around us didn't stop, not completely, but they shifted, like a ripple moving through still water, and I felt it before I saw it. His attention snapping toward me, not slowly, not casually, but instantly, like a switch had flipped. And when I looked up this time, really looked, his eyes were already on me, sharp and focused in a way that made the rest of the room disappear for a single, suspended second, and the faint hint of amusement that had been there before was gone, replaced by something colder, something more interested. And I realized too late what I had just done, because men like him didn't like surprises, they didn't like variables they hadn't accounted for, and I had just turned myself into one, and the tray in my hands felt suddenly too light. Like I had lost my grip on something I couldn't get back. But I didn't look away, couldn't look away, because backing down now would mean admitting I had made a mistake, and something told me that would be worse than speaking in the first place. So I held his gaze, steady, even as my pulse picked up. Just enough to remind me I was standing in a room where I didn't belong, answering a man who controlled everything in it. And for the first time since I walked in, I wasn't invisible anymore. He did not speak right away. And that silence was worse than anything he could have said because it stretched just long enough for everyone at the table to realize something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that made people pay attention without understanding why. And I felt every pair of eyes flicker toward me before quickly looking away again, like they had learned not to stare at things that might turn into problems. But he kept staring, his gaze steady and unblinking. And I could almost hear the calculation behind it. The quiet reordering of assumptions, The moment when I stopped being background noise and became something else entirely, something he had not planned for. And then he moved, just a small step forward, but the space around him adjusted instantly. Chairs scraping softly against marble, conversations lowering another notch, and suddenly he was closer than he had been before, close enough that I could see the faint line of tension along his jaw. The way his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the glass in his hand before relaxing again like he had decided something. And when he spoke this time, it was still in Sicilian, slower, sharper, each word placed with precision, not mocking now, not careless, but deliberate, like he was testing the edges of something he had just discovered, and I understood him again, every syllable. Even the parts that were meant to be subtle, the phrasing that suggested he was not just asking a question but setting a trap, and I knew that if I answered wrong, if I hesitated or softened or tried to backtrack, I would lose whatever fragile balance I had somehow created. So I did not hesitate. I answered him the same way I had before, calm, even, matching his rhythm without raising my voice. And I saw it then, the smallest shift in his expression, not surprise exactly, not anymore, something deeper, something that looked almost like recognition before it disappeared behind that controlled exterior, and the man standing to his right let out a quiet breath like he had been holding it without realizing, while another glanced between us with a flicker of unease that he quickly masked, because whatever this was, it was not part of the evening they had expected, and I realized I was still holding the tray, still standing there like I had not just crossed a line I could not uncross. An instinct told me to move, to step back, to return to the safety of being overlooked, but his voice stopped me. Before I could take a single step, switching to English now, smooth and effortless, but carrying that same controlled weight underneath, asking me where I had learned to speak like that, not accusing, not demanding, but not giving me room to ignore the question either, and I felt the answer rise in my throat before I forced it down, because this was not a question he needed answered, it was a question he wanted answered, and there was a difference. So I met his gaze and said the simplest thing. That was still true, that I had picked it up a long time ago, that people forget how much you can learn just by listening, and for a second, just a second, something in his eyes sharpened like that answer mattered more than it should have, like it connected to something he had not said out loud, and then it was gone, replaced by that same unreadable calm, and he gave a small nod, not dismissive, not approving, just acknowledging, before stepping back as if the moment had ended, as if I had been nothing more than a brief distraction in a night full of more important things, and the room seemed to exhale around us. Conversations picking back up, the soft clink of glasses returning, the illusion of normalcy sliding back into place like it had never been disturbed, and I turned to leave, forcing my hands to stay steady as I carried the tray away from the table, each step measured, controlled, until I reached the edge of the room where the shadows felt safer, where I could almost disappear again, but I could still feel it, the weight of his attention lingering even when I was not looking, like he had not let go of whatever question I had just become, and I told myself it did not matter, that men like him lived in a world far removed from mine, that whatever this was would fade the moment I walked out of those doors at the end of my shift, but something deep in my chest disagreed, something quiet and certain that had been there long before tonight, whispering that I had just stepped into something that would not let me walk away so easily. And when I finally allowed myself one quick glance back across the room, his eyes were already on me, like he had been watching the entire time, waiting, measuring, and for the first time since I answered him, I understood the real mistake was not that I had spoken, it was that I had been heard. I made it exactly 12 steps before someone blocked my path, and I knew without looking up who it would be because the air shifted again in that subtle way I was starting to recognize, like the room itself adjusted around his presence before he even spoke, and when I lifted my eyes, Luca De Lorenzo was standing there, not close enough to touch, but close enough that leaving without acknowledging him would feel like a challenge, and something told me he would not ignore that, so I stopped, balancing the tray against my hip as if my hands were not suddenly too aware of every movement. And for a moment neither of us said anything, which should have felt awkward but did not. It felt measured, like he was giving me space to react first, to decide whether I would hold my ground or step back into the role I was supposed to play, and I realized this was another test, quieter than the first but more dangerous because it did not announce itself, and I was tired of being tested, tired of pretending I did not understand the rules when I had spent years learning how to read rooms just like this, even if they had never looked quite so polished. So I held his gaze again, steady, waiting, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, controlled but not cold, asking if I always answered conversations that were not meant for me. And there was something almost curious in the way he said it, like he genuinely wanted to know, like I had disrupted more than just his expectations. And I let out a quiet breath before answering, keeping my tone even, telling him that people should be more careful about what they say in public if they do not want to be understood. And I saw the corner of his mouth shift slightly, not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement that I had chosen not to retreat, and the silence that followed was shorter this time, more charged, because now it was not about whether I could keep up, it was about whether I would back down, and I did not. Not when everything in me said that stepping back now would erase whatever respect I had just forced him to give me. And respect was not something men like him handed out freely. It was taken, earned, or recognized in moments like this. And then he did something I did not expect. He stepped to the side, just enough to let a guest pass between us, breaking the direct line without actually ending the conversation. And when his attention returned to me, it was sharper, more focused, like he had made a decision. And he asked again, in Sicilian this time, but faster, more complex, the kind of phrasing that was meant to trip someone up, to expose the limits of what they knew. And I felt the old instinct rise in my chest, the part of me that remembered sitting at a kitchen table too small for the voices that filled it, listening, learning, understanding long before I was supposed to. And I answered him again without hesitation, matching his pace, his tone, even the slight inflection that marked the region the language came from. And this time I did not look away when I finished. I let the words settle between us, let him decide what they meant, and the reaction was immediate, not from him, not at first, but from the men standing just behind him, one of them shifting his weight like something had just become uncomfortable, another glancing at Luca with a flicker of uncertainty that he quickly hid, because whatever I had said, it had crossed another invisible line. One I could not fully see but could definitely feel. And then Luca moved again, closer this time. Not enough to invade my space, but enough that the distance between us felt intentional, controlled. And when he spoke, it was back in English, softer now, almost thoughtful, saying that most people who understood that dialect did not learn it by accident. And I felt my pulse pick up just slightly, not out of fear but out of recognition, because he was not asking anymore. He was observing, drawing conclusions, and I knew better than to confirm or deny them outright. So I gave him nothing more than a small shrug, telling him that people come from places they do not always talk about, and for a moment something unreadable flickered in his eyes, something that looked almost like he had heard that answer before, from someone else, somewhere else, and then it was gone, replaced again by that calm, controlled presence that made everyone else in the room fade into the background. And he studied me for one more second before stepping back fully this time, giving me space in a way that felt less like dismissal and more like a pause. Like this conversation was not over, just delayed. And as I turned to leave again, I realized my shift had changed in a way I could not undo, because I was no longer just moving through the room unnoticed. I was being watched, measured, remembered. And when I reached the edge of the ballroom and glanced back once more, not because I wanted to, but because something pulled me to, he was still there, still exactly where I had left him, but his attention was no longer on the people around him. It was on me. And this time he did not look away when I caught him. He held the moment just long enough to make one thing clear without saying a word. He had not finished figuring me out, and he was not going to stop until he did. By the time I reached the service corridor, my pulse had not slowed. It had only changed, steadier now, but heavier, like something had settled into place whether I wanted it to or not. And the quiet behind the ballroom doors felt almost unreal compared to the controlled tension I had just stepped out of, the hum of refrigeration units and distant kitchen noise grounding me in a way the polished marble and crystal never could. And I told myself to focus, to finish the shift, to move through the rest of the night like nothing had happened, because that was the only way this worked. You kept going. You stayed invisible. You did not let moments like that follow you home. But even as I repeated it in my head, I knew it was already too late, because men like Luca De Lorenzo did not forget, They did not overlook things that did not fit, and I had just made myself impossible to ignore. And the thought should have scared me more than it did, but instead it left a strange kind of clarity, like a line had been crossed, and there was no point pretending otherwise. And I pushed through the swinging kitchen door, letting the noise swallow me for a moment, plates clattering, voices overlapping, the familiar rhythm of service pulling me back into motion as I set the tray down and reached for another without thinking. Because routine was easier than reflection, but it did not last long, because within minutes someone was calling my name, sharper than necessary, and when I turned, it was Mark, the floor manager, his expression tight in a way that told me this was not about a spilled drink or a missed order, and he jerked his head toward the back hallway, telling me I was needed, not asking, not explaining, just stating it like a fact I had no choice but to follow. And something in my chest tightened again, not fear exactly, more like recognition, because I knew who would be waiting before I even took the first step. And still I went, because refusing was not an option, not here, not now. And the hallway felt longer than it should have, each step echoing just a little too loud against the polished floor until I reached the private lounge door, slightly ajar, soft light spilling through the gap, and I paused for half a second, just long enough to steady my breathing before pushing it open. And there he was, standing near the window overlooking the city, the skyline stretching out behind him like something he owned rather than something he simply observed, his posture relaxed, but intentional, one hand resting against the back of a chair, the other empty now, no glass, no distraction, just focus. And he did not turn immediately when I stepped inside, which told me he already knew I was there, that he had heard my footsteps, measured them, decided exactly when to acknowledge me. And when he finally did, his gaze found mine with that same quiet intensity, like the rest of the room did not exist, like this conversation was the only thing that mattered in that moment. And for a second neither of us spoke, the silence settling between us again, but this time it felt different, less like a test, and more like a decision waiting to be made. And when he did speak, his voice was calm, controlled, asking me to close the door behind me. Not a command, not quite, but not something that invited refusal either, and I hesitated just long enough to feel the weight of the choice before doing it. The soft click of the door sealing off the outside world in a way that made everything feel more focused, more real, and I stayed where I was instead of stepping closer, setting the boundary in the only way I could without saying it out loud. And he noticed. I saw it in the slight shift of his expression, not offended, not surprised, just aware, like he was cataloging every detail I gave him. And then he spoke again, not in Sicilian this time, but in English, quieter than before, asking me a different question, not where I learned the language, not how long I had known it, but why I chose to answer him at all. And that caught me off guard in a way the others had not, because it was not about skill or knowledge, it was about intent, about the decision I had made in that moment. And I felt the truth rise up before I could filter it, simple and unpolished, because you do not get to decide who understands you. And something in his eyes shifted again when I said it, something sharper, more focused, like that answer mattered in a way I did not fully understand. And for a second the room felt smaller, quieter, like everything had narrowed down to the space between us. And I realized this was not just curiosity. This was something else, something deeper, because he was not just trying to understand what I knew. He was trying to understand who I was, and that was a much more dangerous question to answer. He did not respond immediately, and that silence pressed in closer than the walls around us, not heavy but deliberate, like he was turning my words over piece by piece, testing their weight before deciding what they meant. And I held my ground even as something in my chest tightened, not from fear, but from the awareness that this was the moment where things could shift again, where he could decide I was interesting enough to keep watching or insignificant enough to dismiss. And the difference between those two outcomes felt smaller than it should have. And then he exhaled slowly, almost quietly, his gaze never leaving mine as he stepped away from the window, closing the distance between us by just enough to make the space feel intentional again, controlled. And when he spoke, his voice carried that same calm authority, but there was something else beneath it now, something more focused, more personal, asking me if I always spoke like I had nothing to lose. And the question landed differently than the others, because it was not about language or skill, it was about risk, about the way I had chosen to stand in front of him without backing down, and I felt a faint, almost involuntary smile tug at the corner of my mouth before I could stop it, not out of amusement but recognition, because people only ask that question when they think you might actually mean it, and I told him the truth again, quieter this time, that sometimes people assume you have less to lose than you actually do, and that is when they start underestimating you. And something in his expression sharpened at that, not offended, not challenged, just more attentive, like he was beginning to see a pattern where before there had only been fragments. And for a moment neither of us moved, the quiet stretching just long enough to feel intentional again, until he shifted slightly, his attention flicking toward the door for the briefest second before returning to me, like he was aware of everything outside this room without needing to look. And then he asked another question, softer, almost casual if not for the precision behind it, asking me if I understood everything I had heard earlier, not just the language but the meaning behind it. And I knew that was not something I could answer carelessly, not when the wrong response could pull me deeper into something I had no intention of being part of. So I chose my words carefully, telling him that understanding words and understanding intent are not always the same thing, and that sometimes it is safer to pretend you only hear half of what is said. And I watched the reaction ripple through him, subtle but unmistakable, like that answer had confirmed something he had been considering without forcing me to admit anything directly. And for a second the room felt even quieter, the city lights beyond the window casting a faint glow that reflected in his eyes, making them harder to read but not less intense. And then he did something unexpected. He nodded, just once, not approving, not dismissing, just acknowledging the line I had drawn and the way I had chosen to stand behind it. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more measured, telling me that most people in my position would have said less, would have tried to disappear after the first mistake, and I met his gaze without hesitation, correcting him before I could stop myself, telling him that answering him was not a mistake, and the words hung between us for a second longer than they should have, because I had just shifted the balance again, not by raising my voice or stepping closer, but by refusing to let him define the moment for me. And this time I saw it clearly, the faintest trace of something that almost resembled respect crossing his expression before it settled back into that controlled calm. And he studied me for another long second before stepping back, creating just enough distance to signal that the conversation was reaching its edge, not ending, but pausing. And when he spoke again, it was simpler, quieter, telling me to go back to work, not as a dismissal but as a decision, like he was choosing to let me walk away for now. And I hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second before nodding, turning toward the door and reaching for the handle, feeling his gaze on me the entire time, steady and unrelenting. And just before I stepped out, his voice stopped me again, softer than before, but carrying enough weight to hold me in place, saying my name like he had known it longer than he should have. And I froze for a heartbeat before glancing back over my shoulder, meeting his eyes one more time as he added quietly that this was not over. And something in the way he said it made it clear he was not making a threat, he was stating a fact. And as I stepped back into the hallway, the noise of the kitchen rushing in to fill the silence behind me, I realized the shift had already happened, not just in how he saw me, but in how I saw him. Because this was no longer about a moment in a crowded room. It was about a line that had been crossed from both sides, and neither of us was pretending otherwise anymore. The noise of the kitchen should have pulled me back into rhythm, but it did not. It only blurred around the edges as I moved through the motions of the next hour, picking up trays, setting down glasses, responding to orders with automatic precision while my mind stayed somewhere behind that closed door, replaying every word, every look, every pause like it meant more than it should. And I kept telling myself to let it go, that this was temporary, that by the end of the night I would walk out, and it would all fade into something distant and irrelevant. But the feeling did not fade. It sharpened, settling into something steady and unavoidable, because I knew men like him did not leave things unfinished. And the way he had said my name, the way he had looked at me like I was something he needed to understand, that was not something that disappeared with distance. And I almost missed the moment when the balance of the room shifted again, because this time it was not subtle, it was loud. In a quiet way, the kind of attention that did not need raised voices or sudden movement, just a change in tone, a slight hesitation in conversation, The way people adjusted their posture without realizing they were doing it, and I turned just enough to see what had caused it. Another group entering the ballroom, not as controlled as Luca, not as quiet, but carrying their own kind of presence, the kind that pushed instead of pulled. And I saw it immediately in the way the staff reacted, the quick glances, the subtle tension, the way Mark moved faster than usual to intercept them. And I knew before anyone said anything that this was not a normal part of the evening. And I should have stayed out of it. I should have kept my head down and focused on my section. But something in the way one of them looked around the room, assessing, dismissive, caught my attention in a way I could not ignore. And then his gaze landed on me, lingering just long enough to feel intentional. And I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. Not fear, not exactly. More like anticipation of something that had not happened yet, but was already set in motion. And he smiled. Not warm, not friendly. Just enough to signal that he had noticed me. And I looked away first, not out of submission, but because I had no interest in inviting whatever came next. And for a moment I thought that would be enough, that the moment would pass the way so many others did, unnoticed, unimportant. But I was wrong, because minutes later he was at my table, not waiting to be served, not following the flow of the room, just standing there like he expected the world to adjust around him. And I forced myself to approach, tray in hand, posture steady, voice even as I asked if he needed anything, and his eyes moved over me slowly, deliberately, like he was trying to place something he did not quite understand. And then he spoke, his tone casual but edged with something sharper underneath, asking where I had learned to speak like that. And the question hit harder this time because it was not curiosity, it was intrusion, and I felt the shift immediately. The difference between someone who wanted to understand and someone who wanted to claim knowledge as leverage. And I gave him nothing, the same measured answer as before, that people learn things in unexpected ways. And he let out a soft laugh that did not quite reach his eyes, leaning slightly closer without crossing the line, telling me that I should be careful what I reveal in rooms like this, that not everyone appreciated surprises, and the words were light, but the meaning was not. And I held his gaze just long enough to make it clear I understood exactly what he was implying before stepping back, keeping the distance I had chosen, because this was not a conversation I intended to have. And that was when I felt it again, not from him, not from the man standing in front of me, but from across the room, a different kind of attention, steady, controlled, unmistakable. And I did not need to look to know it was Luca, did not need to turn to confirm that he was watching, because I could feel the shift in the air, the way the space seemed to tighten just slightly, like something was being measured again, something was being decided, and the man in front of me seemed to notice it too, his expression flickering for a fraction of a second before settling back into that same careless confidence. And I realized then that whatever line I had crossed earlier had not just been noticed by one person. It had been seen, evaluated, and now it was being tested from another direction. And for the first time since the night began, I understood that this was no longer just about holding my ground. It was about choosing which direction to stand in. Because in a room like this, neutrality did not exist, and the moment I had answered in a language I was not supposed to understand, I had already stepped onto his side whether I meant to or not. The man did not step back when I created distance, and that told me everything I needed to know about him. Because people who respected boundaries noticed them, even in rooms like this. But he only smiled again, slower this time, like he enjoyed the tension more than the conversation, and I could feel the weight of attention around us shifting, subtle but present, like nearby tables were aware something was happening without fully understanding what. And I kept my posture steady, my voice neutral as I asked if he would like to order anything or if he was just there to observe, and that earned a quiet chuckle from him, the kind that was meant to sound casual but carried something sharper underneath. And he said that he was interested in more than the menu, that sometimes the most unexpected things in a room were the most valuable, and the implication was clear enough without being spoken directly. And I met his gaze just long enough to acknowledge it before answering that not everything unexpected was meant to be taken. And something in his expression flickered, not anger, not quite, but recognition that I was not going to play along with whatever version of control he was used to. And for a second the space between us felt tighter, more defined, like an invisible line had been drawn, and neither of us was willing to step across it first. And then he shifted slightly, his tone changing just enough to suggest he was trying a different approach, asking again about the language, this time more direct, more insistent, and I could feel the difference immediately, the pressure behind the question, the expectation that I would eventually give him something he could use, but I did not. I held the same line, the same calm response, because giving him more would not end the conversation, it would only deepen it, and that was not something I intended to allow. And I saw it then, the brief flash of irritation that crossed his face before he smoothed it over, because he was not used to being denied, not in ways that looked like politeness but felt like resistance, and for a moment it seemed like he might push further, like he might test the boundary more directly. But then something changed, not in him, not entirely, but in the space around us, a shift that came from somewhere else, and I felt it before I saw it. That same controlled presence cutting through the room without raising its voice. And when I glanced past the man in front of me, Luca was already moving toward us. Not fast, not rushed, just deliberate, the kind of movement that did not need urgency, because it assumed the outcome before it arrived. And the difference between the two men became clearer in that moment. One pushed, the other pulled. One filled space loudly, the other reshaped it quietly, and the man in front of me noticed it too. I saw the way his posture adjusted just slightly, the way his attention flickered over my shoulder before returning to me with a different kind of focus, like he was recalculating something he had not expected to change, and I stayed where I was, not stepping back, not stepping forward, because this was not a moment to react. It was a moment to hold position, and when Luca stopped beside us, close enough that his presence was undeniable but not intrusive, the air shifted again, quieter this time, but heavier, and he did not look at me first. He looked at the other man, his expression calm, unreadable, like nothing about this situation surprised him, and when he spoke, his voice was even, controlled, carrying just enough weight to draw a line without raising it, asking if there was a problem. And the question sounded simple, almost casual, but it was not. It was a statement disguised as a question, and the man in front of me smiled again, slower now, more measured, telling him that there was no problem, that he was just having a conversation. And Luca's gaze held his for a second longer than necessary, not challenging, not yielding, just steady, and then he turned his attention to me, just for a moment, and that was enough, because in that brief glance there was something unspoken, something that acknowledged the situation without forcing me into it. And I realized then that this was not about being rescued or defended. It was about something else entirely, something quieter, more deliberate. And when Luca spoke again, still calm, still controlled, he said that the staff had responsibilities to attend to, and that distractions were rarely appreciated. And the words were directed outward, but they landed exactly where they were meant to, and the man in front of me let out a soft breath, not quite a laugh, not quite agreement, before stepping back just enough to release the tension without admitting it had been there. And I did not move immediately, did not rush to fill the space, because I understood what had just happened, not as a confrontation, but as a shift, a boundary reinforced without being forced. And when I finally turned to leave, tray still steady in my hands, I could feel both of their attention linger for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. And for the first time since the night began, I realized that whatever this had become, it was no longer something I could navigate by staying unnoticed, because now I was part of it, whether I wanted to be or not. The moment passed without noise, but it did not disappear. It settled into the room like something invisible that everyone felt but no one acknowledged. And I moved away from the table with steady steps, not too fast, not too slow, because rushing would turn attention into something sharper, and lingering would invite it back. And I had learned enough tonight to know that balance was everything. But even as I returned to my section, taking orders, refilling glasses, responding to quiet requests, with practiced ease, the shift remained, threading through every interaction, every glance, because I was no longer just part of the background. I was part of the awareness, and that changed the way people looked at me, not openly, not directly, but in those small, careful ways that only exist in rooms where power is understood without being spoken. And I could feel it in the way a guest paused half a second longer before handing me a glass, in the way another avoided eye contact entirely, like proximity to something undefined made them uncomfortable. And I kept my focus forward, on the work, on the rhythm, because that was the only way to stay grounded. But even then, I could feel it, The steady presence across the room, not overwhelming, not intrusive, just there, like a constant point I could not ignore even when I tried, and I did not need to look to know it was him, because it had become something I recognized without sight, the same way you recognize a shift in temperature before you consciously notice the change. And I told myself again that this would end when the night ended, that whatever this connection was, it existed only within these walls, under these lights, and outside of it. Everything would return to what it had been before, simple, quiet, separate, but the thought felt less certain now, less convincing, because something about the way he had intervened, not loudly, not possessively, but deliberately, suggested that this was not just a moment he would forget, and that realization settled deeper than I wanted it to, because it meant I had not just been seen, I had been chosen to be noticed, and that was not something you stepped away from easily. And I almost missed the moment when he approached again, not because he was subtle, but because I had stopped expecting it so soon. And when I turned, he was already there, standing just to the side of my station, not blocking my movement, not drawing attention, just present, like he had always been part of the space. And I felt the familiar tightening in my chest before I forced it to steady, because reacting now would undo everything I had maintained so far. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, not meant for anyone else to hear, asking if I was always this composed under pressure, and I let out a small breath before answering, telling him that composure is easier when you know what you are dealing with. And his gaze held mine for a second longer, searching, measuring, like he was deciding whether I truly understood the situation or just believed I did. And then he asked another question, simpler on the surface but heavier underneath, asking me if I knew who that man had been. And I paused, not because I did not have an answer, but because I understood the weight behind the question, because knowing meant something, and admitting it meant something else entirely. And I chose the line I had been walking all night, telling him that I knew enough to recognize when a conversation was not worth having. And something in his expression shifted again, not surprise, not approval, but something closer to confirmation, like I had just reinforced a conclusion he had already reached. And for a moment the space between us felt quieter than the rest of the room, like everything beyond it had faded into something distant. And then he nodded once, slow, deliberate, before stepping back just enough to give me room to move again, but not enough to create distance. And when he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost thoughtful, telling me that most people in my position would have handled that differently. And I met his gaze without hesitation, answering that most people are not in my position. And this time there was no mistaking the reaction, the faintest trace of something real crossing his expression before it settled back into control. And for a second longer than necessary, we just stood there, not speaking, not moving, the silence between us carrying more weight than any words could have. And I realized then that whatever this had become, it was no longer about proving anything, not to him, not to anyone else. It was about something else entirely, something quieter, something that existed in the space between what was said and what was understood. And as he finally stepped away, blending back into the room without losing that sense of presence that followed him everywhere, I felt it settle into place, that this was not ending tonight, not when the doors closed, not when I walked out into the night air, because whatever had started between us was not tied to the room, it was tied to recognition. And recognition does not disappear just because the setting changes. The night did not end all at once. It unraveled slowly, table by table, glass by glass, until the music softened and the conversations thinned into something quieter, something less guarded, and I moved through it like I always did, clearing the last of the tables, stacking plates, collecting empty glasses with hands that had learned to stay steady no matter what the night held. But this time it felt different, not because the work had changed, but because I had, and I could feel it in the way the room no longer blurred around me, in the way every detail seemed sharper, more defined, like I had stepped out of the background and could not step back in. And when the final guest left and the doors closed behind them, the silence that followed was not relief. It was something else, something that settled heavier in the absence of noise. And I finished the last of my tasks without thinking, without rushing, just moving through the routine until there was nothing left to do but leave. And for a moment, I stood near the exit, coat in hand, looking at the empty ballroom that had felt so full just hours ago, wondering if it would all feel distant once I stepped outside, if the weight of it would fade the way long shifts usually did. But before I could answer that, I felt it again, that quiet shift in the air, the same one that had followed him all night. And I did not need to turn to know he was there, but I did anyway, because pretending not to notice had stopped working a long time ago, and Luca was standing a few feet behind me. No crowd, no distractions, just him, his presence somehow more defined without the room around him to absorb it. And for a second neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us in a way that felt familiar now, not uncomfortable, just deliberate, like both of us understood that whatever was said next would matter more than anything that had come before. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been all night, not carrying across a room, just reaching me, asking if I always walked away without looking back, and I let out a small breath before answering, telling him that sometimes leaving is the only way to keep things from becoming something else. And his gaze held mine for a second longer, something unreadable flickering there before settling into that same controlled calm. And he stepped closer, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough to make it clear he was choosing not to let the moment end so easily. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that same measured tone, telling me that most people would have avoided him after tonight, would have tried to disappear before they were noticed again. And I met his gaze, without hesitation, answering that most people had not already been noticed. And for a second the air between us felt sharper, like something had shifted again, not in opposition, not in challenge, but in understanding. And he studied me for a moment longer before asking one final question, softer now, almost thoughtful, asking me if I intended to forget everything that had happened tonight. And the question lingered longer than the others, because this time it was not about knowledge or language or control. It was about choice, and I felt the answer settle before I spoke, simple, steady, telling him that forgetting is easy when something does not matter, and this did. And for the first time since I had met him, there was no mistaking the reaction, not dramatic, not obvious, but real, something in his expression shifting just enough to break through the control he carried so effortlessly, and it was gone just as quickly, replaced by that same calm presence. But the moment had already happened, and neither of us pretended otherwise, and he nodded once, slow, deliberate, like he was accepting something rather than deciding it, and then he stepped back, creating space without breaking the connection entirely. And when he spoke again, his voice was quiet but certain, telling me that he would see me again, not as a question, not as a suggestion, but as a fact. And I held his gaze for a second longer before turning toward the door, pushing it open and stepping out into the cool night air, the city stretching out in front of me, loud and alive in a way the ballroom had never been. And as I walked away, I could still feel it, not his presence exactly, but the awareness of it, the recognition that something had begun whether I had intended it or not. And for the first time that night, I did not try to convince myself it would fade, because some moments do not disappear when the doors close. They follow you, quiet and certain, until you are forced to face what they mean. And I knew without needing to look back that this was one of them.